My mother-in-law demands to buy my child because it's immoral for single fathers to raise kids after her daughter cheated and abandoned us. When I refused, she accused me of abuse and called CPS to take away my kid. But when you try to take someone down, don't be surprised when they take you down first. I have been a single father to my daughter for the past 6 years. She is the light of my life, and I love her more than anything. But what brought me here? My life was turned upside down 6 years ago, and it hasn't been the same since. My ex-wife and I met in college, and while we were dating casually, things were sweet and fun. We hadn't planned on getting married until the unplanned pregnancy. We decided to marry for our daughter's sake. I never regretted my daughter's birth, not for a moment, and I wouldn't have it any other way. In the early years as a family, life seemed good. We had a nice house, steady jobs, and a loving family. I thought we had everything anyone could want. Sure, we had problems like any couple, but I tried to do right by my family. Then everything changed when my wife left. She vanished one day, leaving behind only a note and signed divorce papers. She wrote that she had found her true love and wanted to start a new life with him. She apologized, but said she didn't want to be a mother or wife anymore and had never signed up for it. She even said I could tell our daughter the truth when she was old enough to understand. My ex demanded no alimony, no marital assets, and no rights over our daughter. I was heartbroken, devastated beyond words. I couldn't believe she had abandoned us, especially our little girl. My daughter was only 2 years old, and her mother didn't even say goodbye. She just left. A cold, calculated decision that shattered everything I thought I knew. For months, I tried to contact her. I called, texted, and even tried social media, but she had blocked me on everything. She had moved to another state with a man she ran away with, someone she met at her gym. The man she ran off with was a mystery. I tried to get answers by contacting his family, but he lived alone, and no one seemed to know much about him. I even tracked down his former workplace, but they told me he had quit around the time they eloped. It felt like I was chasing ghosts, hoping for answers I never got. I reached out to her family, my in-laws, but they had been cut off too. She didn't just leave us, she left them as well. Everyone was left in the dark. The worst part was that I had no closure, no understanding of why it all fell apart so suddenly. I had been married to her for 10 years. We weren't perfect, but I thought we were happy, or at least I thought we were content. And then, one day, it was all gone. Everything I knew about my life with her, about our family, was a lie. But as hard as it was, I focused on raising our daughter. I tried my best to be a good husband before, and now I dedicated everything to being a good father. Our bond grew stronger over the years. While the pain of my wife's abandonment still lingers, my daughter is my reason to keep going. For her, I've moved forward, even when I thought I couldn't. Eventually, I decided to stop searching for answers. There was nothing left to find, and honestly, I didn't want her back in my life. I was angry, hurt, and confused, but I had to move on for my daughter. At the time, she was too young to fully understand what had happened, but she was smart enough to notice her mother was gone. She would ask me where her mother was and when she would come back. I remember her crying, begging me to bring her back. She told me she missed her and loved her. Seeing my little girl in so much pain was unbearable. No parent should have to watch their child go through that kind of heartache. It broke me. I didn't know what to tell her. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to break her heart any more than it already was. I decided to tell her the truth, but in a way she could understand. I explained that her mother had left because she was unhappy and wanted to find happiness elsewhere. I told her that her mother had a new friend who made her happy, and she had chosen to be with him. I reassured her that her mother still loved her, but for now, she couldn't be with her. More importantly, I told her that I loved her very much and that I would always be with her. I promised her that we would be okay, just the two of us, but she struggled to accept it at first. Every day, she would ask me about her mother, holding on to the hope that she might return. She cried every night, and it broke my heart to see her go through that. School became another challenge. We live in a small town, and news of my wife leaving spread quickly. Some children must have overheard their parents talking because my daughter started coming home upset, hearing cruel comments from other kids. To protect her from more hurt, I decided to move to a new neighborhood and enroll her in a different school. It wasn't easy, but slowly she started to heal. The questions about her mother became less frequent, and eventually she stopped asking altogether. The tears stopped, and she no longer needed to sleep in my bed. I think she began to accept that her mother wasn't coming back. More importantly, she realized it wasn't her fault. She hadn't done anything wrong. Over time, she understood that she wasn't abandoned or unloved, at least not by me. Now we never talk about her mother, and I've made peace with that part of our lives. I'm proud of my daughter. She's grown into such a strong and resilient young girl. Recently, she's even started teasing me, telling me to get a girlfriend and joking that I'm going to be single forever. It's funny, but it also makes me proud to see her so lighthearted after everything she's been through. I've worked hard to give her a good life, a loving home, and the best education I could provide. I've always supported her interests and encouraged her talents. Since her mother left 6 years ago, I haven't dated or even considered it. I was too afraid of letting her down again. Sure, I miss companionship sometimes, but my daughter's well-being has always come first, and I've made peace with waiting until she's much older before I think about dating again. We have a good life, just the two of us, and honestly, it never feels like we're missing anything. My family has been an incredible support system too. My daughter is adored and spoiled by her grandparents and uncles. Despite everything, we're doing just fine, maybe even better than fine. Last week, everything took a turn for the worse. My ex-mother-in-law, Nancy, a 55-year-old woman who had been absent from our lives for years, showed up at my place, unannounced and uninvited. I hadn't seen her since my ex-wife left, and even back then, she was barely involved in our lives. Nancy always looked down on me, thinking I wasn't good enough for her daughter because I came from a blue-collar background and didn't have a family fortune. Even during my marriage, she was cold, disapproving, and dismissive. After my ex-wife abandoned us, Nancy disappeared completely. No calls, no cards, not even a gift for her granddaughter's birthdays. She showed zero interest in my daughter, never apologized, never explained her daughter's actions. Yet here she was, standing at my door, acting like I owed her something. At first, I didn't even recognize her. It had been so long. She had to introduce herself, and I was stunned, confused. I asked her what she was doing at my house. Without hesitation, she gave me this condescending look, like I was the unreasonable one, and said she was there to meet her granddaughter, to rescue her from the dump I'd been raising her in. I was floored. Before I could say a word, she started lecturing me about how she found out my daughter was attending a public school and how unacceptable it was for a child in her family to have such low standards for education. Then she told me my ex-wife had moved back into the family home with her new husband and that, to complete their family, my daughter needed to return to them. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. For a second, I thought she might be joking. A dump? Low standards? And what was this talk about a real family? The only family my daughter had known for years was me and my side of the family. Did Nancy seriously think she, her irresponsible daughter, and some random guy were better suited to raise my daughter than I was? Sure, I'm not wealthy, and my daughter isn't living in luxury, but she's far from deprived. She goes to a good school, and I'm involved in her education. I've done everything I can to support her, and she's thriving. Luxury doesn't equate to love, care, or a stable home. I told Nancy she had no right to see my daughter and absolutely no right to take her. I made it clear the only grandmother my daughter had was my mother. I demanded she leave, and when she refused, I threatened to call the police for trespassing. That's when Nancy revealed her true intentions. She said if I didn't cooperate, she had the money to hire the best lawyers and would take me to court. I laughed and asked on what grounds. That's when she dropped the bombshell. She said she would make up a false case of abuse against me. She claimed she could accuse me of forcing her daughter to abandon the family and run away to save her own life. I was speechless. Her accusations were absurd, completely fabricated, but I knew how dangerous they could be. Nancy had money, connections. Her family had a long history in law enforcement. My late father-in-law and my ex-wife's grandfather were police officers. I knew they had influence in certain circles, and it terrified me to think how easily they could ruin my life. I tried to reason with her. I begged her not to do this, telling her that my daughter was happy and healthy with me. I even suggested we could talk to my daughter and let her decide if she wanted to get to know her grandmother. I said I had no problem with them meeting, but Nancy wouldn't listen. She didn't care about my daughter's feelings. She only cared about winning. Before she left, she gave me an ultimatum. I had 1 week to get back to her, or I'd be hearing from her lawyer. I have been a wreck ever since. I didn't know where to turn for help. I thought about getting a lawyer, of course, but I wondered what good that would do if they were threatening to plant false evidence against me. I was terrified about the future, because I know what kind of woman she is, and the courts rarely favor single fathers. I couldn't bear the thought of losing my daughter. She's everything to me, but I don't have the money to hire the best lawyers, so things aren't looking good. I was still processing everything when she did something even more outrageous than I expected. She offered me money to let her take my daughter. She said that if I didn't want to deal with all the unpleasant and expensive court procedures, we could handle this more simply. When I asked her what she meant, she offered me $500,000. She said that if I took the money and walked away, no one would get hurt, and I would never have to work again. When I got angry and refused her ridiculous offer, her tone completely changed. She said she had tried to resolve things peacefully, but if I wanted to make it difficult, she was more than happy to go down that road. The idea of my daughter living with her grandmother is impossible to accept, but the fact remains that my daughter is a minor and could be taken away from me against our wishes. My daughter doesn't know anything about this, and I'm not sure if I should even tell her. I don't think she even remembers her grandmother. After a week of total agony, I called my mother-in-law and told her I had no interest in fighting a false case in court and that I wouldn't accept her money because my daughter isn't something to be bought or traded. I told her my daughter had no interest in seeing her mother. This was true. I had spoken to my daughter and she made it clear that the only person she wanted to stay with was me. Nancy's reaction was predictable. She told me that as a child, my daughter didn't know what was in her best interest, but as her father, I should. I told her I knew exactly what was best for my daughter and didn't need her opinion. She said she would be at my door tomorrow, and I'd either have to let her take my daughter or face the consequences. I hung up. I already knew what I had to do. The next day, she did show up at my door, but I wasn't there. I was at my neighbor's house, watching everything from a distance. My daughter opened the door for Nancy, and after a while, I saw Nancy's car drive away. I wasn't sure if my daughter had left with her, but I prayed that everything would go as planned. It was around 11 in the morning when Nancy left, and from that moment, I waited for the call I knew was coming. It was the longest, most stressful hour of my life. Just after noon, my phone rang. It was a woman from Child Protective Services. She asked if I knew where my daughter was. Trying to stay calm, I told her I wasn't home, but as far as I knew, my daughter should still be there. The woman explained that she had received a call from my daughter, who said she was being kept at her grandmother's house against her wishes. She asked if I had given permission for my daughter to be taken. I told her I hadn't. I explained that I had been having disagreements with my ex-mother-in-law, but I never allowed my daughter to go anywhere with her. The woman asked me to come down to the precinct, where they were holding my daughter. I rushed there, my heart racing. When I arrived, I found my daughter in tears. She ran straight into my arms, and I felt a wave of relief. But things were far from over. The whole situation was a mess. After talking with everyone, my daughter, me, my mother-in-law, my ex-wife, and her husband, it became clear to the authorities that no child abuse had taken place. They determined it was a family matter. We were warned that if my daughter experienced any more distress, there would be legal consequences and welfare checks might be done at my home. I did my best to cooperate, making it clear that my only concern was my daughter's safety. CPS questioned my daughter, and though I don't know exactly what they discussed, my daughter later told me she had explained that she was happy living with me and didn't want to be with people she barely knew, like her grandmother and mother. In the end, she was allowed to come home with me, and I couldn't have been more relieved. At the precinct, I briefly crossed paths with my ex-wife and her new husband. We barely spoke, but I did have a conversation with Nancy, my mother-in-law, and it wasn't friendly. She accused me of setting everything up, saying I had manipulated my daughter into calling the police. She warned me that I had messed everything up and there would be consequences. I told her she never should have taken my daughter without my permission and made it clear I had no part in what followed. I left with my daughter, grateful to have her back, but worried about what they might try next. Even though I feel like they won't follow through with their plan to create a false case against me, it's clear they just want control over my daughter. But I can't shake the feeling that something else is coming. You never know with them. As I was leaving the precinct, my ex-wife caught up to me. Her words hit hard. She accused me of being a terrible father, saying our daughter needed her mother's and grandmother's love, and that I was depriving her of it. I didn't want to argue with her, but I lost my temper. I told her she had no right to talk, that she wasn't a mother. She tried to defend herself, saying she was a better person now and just wanted to be part of our daughter's life, but I couldn't listen anymore. I walked away before she could manipulate me further. Since that day, her words have stuck with me. Am I really being a bad father? Am I wrong for not letting my daughter have a relationship with her mother and grandmother? Hey everyone, I've been trying to read through all your comments and messages. I appreciate all the support and advice, but there are some things I can't answer. I need to stay anonymous to protect myself, especially since I don't want anyone from my ex-wife's family to find this post and use it against me. That said, I've got some good news and some bad news. First, the good news, Nancy hasn't caused any new trouble for me. I'm still on edge, waiting for something to happen, but so far, nothing. Now for the bad news. A couple of days after the big incident, I was at home making dinner when I heard the doorbell ring. I glanced at the clock, thinking it was too early for my daughter to be back from soccer practice. I figured it was probably a delivery or a neighbor, so I went to answer it. But when I opened the door, what I saw was far from casual. Standing there, with tears in her eyes, was my ex-wife. Yes, my ex-wife. The one person I never expected to see at my doorstep again. To say I was shocked would be the understatement of the century. There she was, in the house we once shared, the house where we brought our daughter home from the hospital, the same house she left years ago. For a moment, I was thrown back to when our daughter was a baby, back to when we were trying to save our marriage, but she became colder and more distant with each passing day. I couldn't believe she was there. And in that short moment, I was hit with a flood of emotions. Nostalgia, confusion, and mostly anger. I never got closure after she left. And now, here she was, standing in front of me out of the blue. All I could think about was how bad things could have gotten if my daughter had opened the door instead of me. The thought only made me angrier. I bluntly asked her what she was doing there and if this was some new way to try to take my daughter from me. I told her to leave before I called the police. But before I could say anything else, she started crying. Not just a few tears, but full-on sobbing. Tears running down her face, nose running, struggling to speak through the sobs. I didn't know what to say or do. But before I could collect myself, she started begging me to hear her out, just this once. I didn't want her in my house, but I also didn't want a sobbing woman at my doorstep for the whole neighborhood to see. Against my better judgment, I told her to come inside. We sat down in the living room, and that's when she started pouring her heart out, explaining why she was there. The whole situation feels overwhelming. I'm sitting here, extremely confused. Why now, after all these years? Her sudden appearance was no coincidence, as I expected. She said she had been going through a tough time, which made her rethink the past and realize her mistakes. She told me that she and her husband were in serious debt. They had lost everything. Their jobs, their house, their car, and had nowhere to go and nothing to eat. That's why she turned to Nancy for help. They had hit rock bottom, realized their mistakes, and now wanted to change their lives, starting by making things right with my daughter. She apologized to me several times, saying she knew what she did was terrible and that I didn't have to forgive her. Still, she wanted a chance to be a part of my daughter's life. She promised to prove herself, to be a good mother, and to make up for all the lost time. She teared up while talking about the moments she missed with our daughter. She spoke of sleepless nights, full of regret. I told her I needed time to think about it, but I couldn't promise her anything. It was almost time for my daughter to come back from soccer practice, and I didn't want her to walk in and see her mother crying, so I asked her to leave. Thankfully, she agreed. Now, I've been up all night thinking about what to do. I haven't told my daughter anything yet, but I keep wondering if it's time to forgive. I just want to do what's best for my daughter. I don't want my own hurt and negative feelings toward my wife to get in the way. Maybe co-parenting wouldn't be the worst thing. My opinion keeps changing, and I would appreciate any advice. Some people never change, I guess. I apologize for the late update, but I've been feeling very uneasy. If you read my last post, you know I was considering letting my ex-wife be a part of my daughter's life again. After a lot of soul-searching and reading your comments, many of you suggested giving her another chance. So, I thought maybe I could try. A few days later, I called her. I told her I would speak to our daughter, explained that her mother regretted her actions, and wanted another chance. But I made it clear that I would only consider co-parenting if our daughter agreed. She was obviously overjoyed and thanked me, hoping her daughter would give her another shot. At this point, I still wasn't entirely happy about the situation. I was doing this solely for my daughter's sake, waiting for the right time to tell her everything. But as it turns out, I'm glad I waited. It turns out my ex-wife's sudden reappearance wasn't some moment of regret and remorse like she made it seem. She came to me in desperation because her mother Nancy was threatening to cut her out of the trust fund. Nancy was planning to leave everything to her other daughter Helen and her grandson, unless my ex convinced me to let her back into our daughter's life. A little background on Nancy. She's always been controlling, especially with her daughters. My ex-wife's older sister Helen moved halfway across the country as soon as she turned 18 to get away from their mother. Nancy was just as difficult with her grandchildren, showing up unannounced, questioning every decision, and making life hard. Helen only put up with Nancy because of the trust fund for her son. She knew she had to keep her mother around to have access to the money. My ex-wife and I, on the other hand, didn't care about the trust fund. So when my ex abandoned me and our daughter, I cut ties with Nancy completely. I always told myself that money was never really there, and I'd rather have my daughter surrounded by a loving family than deal with a toxic grandmother for money. But when my ex-wife and her husband lost everything because of his debts, they had no choice but to turn to Nancy for help. Nancy agreed, but with one condition. She wanted her only granddaughter in her life. She told my ex-wife that she had to either reconcile with me or convince me to let them raise our daughter together. My ex-wife knew there was no chance of us reconciling, so she tried the next best thing. She played on my emotions, pretending to be sorry, hoping I'd let her back into our daughter's life. And for a moment, it worked. I was willing to consider co-parenting for my daughter's sake. But my ex-wife got overconfident. She bragged to Helen about how she had fooled me after all these years. Helen saw this as a threat. If my ex-wife and daughter re-entered Nancy's life, Helen and her children would no longer be the only ones in line for the trust fund. If my ex reconciled with Nancy, any future children she had would also be in line for the money. Helen, determined to protect her family's share of the trust, reached out to me and told me everything. I felt incredibly foolish for falling for my ex's lies. I was disgusted by the thought of her using our daughter as a pawn for money. Thankfully, I found out before I told my daughter anything or got her hopes up. I've learned my lesson. No one from that family will ever be allowed near me or my daughter again. Some of you have been asking what I did or said to my ex-wife after I found out the truth. Well, this might be disappointing, but I did nothing. Honestly, I'm done with the drama. I just want to go back to my normal life, the way it was before Nancy showed up again. I told my ex-wife that I had changed my mind about co-parenting and that my daughter wasn't interested in getting to know her either. I also warned her to behave and keep Nancy in check. I made it clear that if they try any more tricks, I won't hesitate to take legal action this time.